I think X4 Foundations is one of the most unique video games out there with basically no competitors. On the other hand, the game is only sitting at mostly positive reviews on Steam, and there isn't even that many reviews to begin with. This is especially strange considering the game series is almost 25 years old, and a lot of players spend literally hundreds or thousands of hours playing it. I am one of those players. I've spent many weekends and way too many work nights making myself sleep deprived with X4 Foundations. My conclusion is, this game is really special, and I'd like to tell you why. X4 Foundations is kind of what you get if you take the concept of empire management and empire building that you see in games like Mount Blade and you apply it to space. It's what you get when you take EVE Online but you make it single player and significantly easier to get into. It triggers in you the same kind of one more turn syndrome that you get from Civilization, from Stellaris, from Factorio. I've had so many Saturdays where I thought to myself, I'm going to do so many things today. I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to play a bunch of games, I'm going to cook some nice food for myself, I'm going to finish a project I've been working on, but none of that happened. This game is really addictive. At its core, X4 Foundations is a space sim, but not just any space sim. What makes X4 Foundations one of the most unique games out there, period, is its fully simulated dynamic economy. Here is how it works. Both the AI and the player can use mining ships to harvest raw resources and then sell them to stations that will refine them into higher tier goods. These goods are then typically refined further in other production stations, with trading ships helping move the goods around throughout the economy. Ultimately, at the very end of this chain, all resources will feed into the construction of new space stations or new space ships. But remember, this thing is completely dynamic and fully simulated, which means that any trader or miner you see in the world is currently fulfilling a real need to keep the economy alive. So if a faction can't have its market demands met, for example because they ran out of ships and nobody wants to trade with them, they will be unable to defend themselves or thrive. They will stagnate. This creates a really unique and really rich sandbox with lots of unpredictable behavior, which then in turn makes it really fun to build up your own empire, to build fleets and to build stations, which then, little by little, allows you to exert more influence on the galaxy as a whole. But the game isn't just the economy. For example, it also has story missions.
This experiment was a thorough success.
This game has a lot to offer. So if what I've been saying so far sounds even remotely interesting to you, it seems like the YouTube algorithm did us both a favor by bringing us together. Thank you, YouTube. But here comes the caveat. When I say that getting into this game is easier than getting into EVE Online, that doesn't mean that getting into X4 is easy. This is still a very complex game. When I did my initial research to understand how to start playing it, the subreddit gave me pretty consistent feedback. No matter what you do, stick with it for at least a dozen hours, because it takes at least that long for the game to click. But before you can do that, you first have to buy the game. But before you buy the game, you probably first want to make an informed decision on whether it's worth your time and money. So with this video, I'd like to help you make that informed decision. I'll walk you through the basic mechanics, how the game plays and feels, what the game has to offer, but also through criticism, both my personal criticism and some of the criticism I've heard from the community. All of this together should hopefully give you a pretty clear picture of what X4 Foundations is, and like I said, help you make an informed decision. But just so you have the right expectations, I will not be teaching you how to play the game quote-unquote perfectly. You'll have to go to a dedicated guide for that. If at any point throughout this video you have questions, feel free to ask them in the comments or on my community Discord. You'll find a link to join in the pinned comment. Alright, hopefully you're curious and interested. Let's start with the basic mechanics. At the core of X4 Foundations is the game's economy. But before we dive into the economy, there are some basics I want to introduce first. The most important one is the composition of the universe. In X4 Foundations, the world is split into these hexagonal shapes called sectors, with each sector typically containing a bunch of space stations and many spaceships. On top of this, the sectors also have a certain amount of natural resources like ore, methane, ice, or hydrogen. Each sector also has a certain proximity to its host star, which determines the amount of sunlight the sector gets, which then, in turn, affects the production efficiency of so-called energy cells, which is the game's measure for electric power. At this point, the pieces of the economy should start falling into place. Since not all goods are available in every sector, transport ships are needed to move stuff from where it is available to where it needs to go. Now, if you factor in things like piracy and warfare between factions, you've got yourself a pretty interesting economic situation. In order to actually move between sectors, a so-called jump gate or accelerator has to be used, but they both work the same way, so I'll just be referring to both as jump gates. Jump gates work in pairs, and the pairings are fixed throughout the game, which means that the arrangement of sectors in the galaxy is also fixed. I think if you look at the footage I'm showing on screen of the in-game map, it should be pretty clear what I mean. This limitation of how you travel means that jump gates are some of the most important strategic objects in the entire galaxy. It can often make a lot of sense to build your trade stations and production stations close to them to keep logistics paths down, but at the same time, they are a fantastic location for a defensive station in order to protect against enemy fleets. And as you can imagine, you'll find lots of ship traffic around the jump gates, especially in the center of the galaxy, which can be quite handy if you're doing bounty hunting or doing some kinky pirate roleplay.
Ahoy!
But no matter if you're stealing or producing stuff yourself, all of these goods will be used to construct new space stations, new space ships, and consumables like drones, ammunition, deployable satellites, mines, and so on. So no matter how much money you might have, if you try to order a fleet of miners from an AI shipyard, unless the resources it needs are present, you won't get your fleet. If you take one thing away from this entire chapter, it's this. No resources means no ships, no stations, nothing. The individual resources are relatively easy to make, so for example, you can take raw silicon and turn it into silicon wafers, then take silicon wafers and turn them into microchips, and then turn microchips into advanced electronics. Most recipes only ever have 2 or 3 input ingredients, so that part's not too hard. The complexity comes more from the fact that you obviously need more than one type of resource to build any space station or spaceship. So if you want to keep an AI's economy alive, or have a self-sufficient economy of your own, you're going to have to figure out an efficient way to move goods around. And the way you do that is by using spaceships. I won't go into too much detail, but the game gives you a lot of fine control in how you'd like your own fleets to behave. On an individual level, you can assign different types of default behaviors to your ship. From simple ones like protect this station, to more complex ones like automine, which will have your miners harvest and sell resources automatically. You can also combine ships together into a fleet. So for example, you could have one mining ship set to automine and then assign 3 other mining ships to the first one with the fleet order mimic behavior. This way, if you make changes with the fleet's commander, all of the subordinates will follow the new orders automatically, which keeps micromanagement down. You can also assign ships to stations directly and simply have the station's manager control the ships as they see fit. On top of all of this, you can even define high-level global orders and trade rules. So for example, forbidding all of your civilian ships from entering a given sector, or telling your stations to not trade with a given faction. Now, on top of all of that, you can even set individual prices and individual trade rules for individual goods in individual stations. Like I said, there's lots of fine control. All of these things are what make X4 Foundations such an amazing automation game. Except, instead of conveyor belts and trains, X4 has spaceships, and relies on you to instill logic into those ships to create a coherent economy. But at the end of the day, X4 Foundations is not just the economy. You actually do spend a fair amount of time in the cockpit of spaceships, especially in the beginning of the game. So let's talk about that now. X4 Foundations is not just an empire builder, it also allows you to fly spaceships yourself. These spaceships come in 4 different sizes: small, medium, large, and extra large. Now you might be, rightfully, asking yourself just how large is large and extra large? Let's try to find out by looking at some boron ships. As you can see in this video, the size differences are staggering. I was already damn impressed when I saw a large ship for the first time, but when I saw the XL ship next to it, fuck me, that thing is massive. I found that quite impressive, especially because I absolutely love just standing on my ship and feeling so ridiculously tiny in comparison. But size isn't everything, it's how you use it. Which is why different factions have their own ship platforms, each associated with a different type of role. These roles cover the usual suspects like trading ships, miners, or destroyers. What makes the ship so interesting though is that different factions have different specialties, essentially. So for example, the Boron heavy fighter Barracuda has 1 engine, 3 small weapons, and 3 shield generators, while the Antigone? Whatever, I'm just gonna call them by their initials. The AR heavy fighter Pulsar Vanguard has 3 engines, 6 small weapons, and 1 small shield generator. Apart from differences in the ship platform, individual components offered by different factions are also different. So a shield generator from one faction might offer more shield capacity, but also take much longer to recharge. These factional differences make building your fleet up quite interesting. It gives you a bit of a choice if you want to go for ships that are really fast, ships that are more fragile but quite powerful, or just go for a balanced mix. But there's one thing you should look out for. If your reputation with a given faction is too bad, they won't sell you any ships, not to mention the good stuff, which is locked behind a relatively high reputation requirement. If you keep upsetting a faction, they might even stop trading with you at all, and if it gets really bad, they'll open fire at you on sight. So keeping an eye on your reputation is quite important, and I find it to be quite a big motivator in how I play the game. Speaking of reputation, each faction has its own set of relations to all other factions in the game. So while everyone is at war with the Xenon, the faction called Ministry of Finance is basically friends with the entire galaxy. The Argon Republic is at war with the Holy Order of the Pontifex, which in turn is in a civil war with the God Realm of the Paranid. So on your journey through the X4 galaxy, you'll actually stumble across quite a lot of battles and lots of spaceship wrecks. But reputations between factions are not fixed. In some of X4's story missions, you get to make a choice. Do you make 2 factions go to war with each other? Or make 2 warring factions make peace? It's really fun to be flying through the galaxy with your spaceship and fundamentally change how the universe evolves. But I'm going off track again. Let's get back to the cockpit experience. You can actually command almost all of the spaceships you see in the game yourself, with notable exceptions being any Xenon or Ka'ak ships. But we all know, spaceships without guns aren't a whole lot of fun, so let's discuss weapons now. There's a lot of choice for weapons, from being up close with the enemy, to sniping from afar, to things in between. There's even special weapons that can, for example, slow down enemies when hit. Given all of this choice, you'll probably find something you'll enjoy. The game also distinguishes between weapons and turrets, with the latter aiming and firing on their own, so if you prefer, you can also fly gunboats, which have tons of turrets, forcing you to focus more on piloting and relative orientations as opposed to aiming. If you want to take it one step further, simply hop into a big destroyer and let your turrets and fleet take care of your enemies for you. In terms of what you'll be fighting, most often it'll be other ships, but sometimes you may find yourself defending one of your space stations or attacking an enemy's defensive station with your own fleet. Sometimes these battles can feel and be pretty epic, but unfortunately I also often found that they can be quite frustrating due to the strange behaving AI or very bullet spongy enemies. Mods can help here. Like with all things in X4, the game gives you a lot of tools, so it is possible to do effective fleet management, but I don't think it's very intuitive, which makes it very hard to understand why your ships behave the way they do and make changes accordingly. A little bit more inherent intelligence would have been really nice, simply to keep down the frustration of losing ships all the damn time to situations that feel very avoidable. Ultimately though, the point of the game is not for you to engage in battles from the pilot's seat, which I think is a bit of a bummer. It's something that I always greatly appreciated about Mount Blade. You grow your army, but you're also growing the combat capabilities of your hero, and get to join the ranks of your soldiers, delivering charges or firing away volleys of arrows. I wish that this feeling of being part of the battle was easier to reach in X4. You really do become mostly an armchair general. Maybe they'll eventually make a change to quote-unquote improve the game in this regard. It remains to be seen. But since the focus of the game is for you to be an armchair general and do more empire management than combat, it also has a lot of tools to support you in this. Let me tell you about my favorite one. Early on, you can collect the resources to construct something called a Singularity Engine Time Accelerator, or SATA for short. It will literally fast forward time, meaning all of your passive income streams are going to become a little more active. This is honestly a very welcome addition to the game, considering how long some things take, and I applaud the developers for having the courage to add it. So just to summarize, while combat is a big component of the game, Empire and fleet management are far more important. This means that essentially in the mid and late game, there isn't really a big need or point to being in the cockpit yourself, especially since there's also a teleportation research you could unlock with varying levels of distance, which simply allows you to teleport to ships or property that you own even if it's further away, meaning that you don't even necessarily need to use your ships for traveling. Personally, I don't mind this too much, but it is a bit weird when you start playing the game almost entirely in the menu. This is not necessarily bad, it just might not be what you're expecting. And in general, I think discussing what playing the game actually feels like merits its own chapter. Let me start by sharing my experience. The main thing I feel when I play X4 is how my caveman brain releases copious amounts of dopamine when numbers go up, and a strong desire to make number go up even more. But before you start turning into a hyper-capitalist as well, you typically start the game with very limited funds and access to only one ship. At this point, you already find yourself in the quote-unquote normal X4 sandbox, so what you do is completely up to you. On one side, this is pretty amazing, but on the other side, it can be really overwhelming, which is why it takes like a dozen hours for the game to start making sense.
What the fuck are we gonna do now? Huh? Oh shit, Nick!
To make this a bit easier, I heavily recommend that you choose a guided or at the very least an assisted game start, because these come with a set of introductory story missions which help you make your first credits, practice docking, do a bit of combat, and so on. But these missions don't fix the quote-unquote underlying problem. The game is still a sandbox, you still have to make up your own goals. I think it's fair to say that most players will choose to grow their empire as their main objective, and you can do this in any number of ways. Let's refer to the rules of acquisition for some inspiration.
And as the 34th rule of acquisition states, peace is good for business.
That's the 35th rule.
Oh, you're right. What's the 34th?
War is good for business. It's easy to get them confused.
Some people might like to have a peaceful trading empire, others might want to focus more on combat missions. I saw this one post on Reddit of somebody doing a proper pirate playthrough. They forbade themselves from buying ships, so all the ships they had were stolen. Plus, they were at war with most of the galaxy, and they could only trade with other pirate factions. I've always wanted to try this. This seems like such an interesting way to play the game. But I'm once again going a little bit off track here. The point is that there's a lot of different ways in which you can play the game, and it's really up to you to find a way that is fun to you personally. The most obvious gameplay loop of simply expanding your empire, getting more and more miners, more and more traders, more and more stations, works fantastically well. I would argue this is the quote-unquote main way to play X4. You'll have to grind a bit for credits in the beginning, but once you buy that first AI miner, your first subordinate, it feels really cool. That first miner won't make you that much money, but once you have 5 or 6 of them, you will start noticing your account balance gradually increasing on its own. That's a very nice feeling. But oh boy, once you get your first profitable production station, my god, seeing other factions, traders, and miners come to your station to deliver goods to it and pick up the product it produces, and seeing your account balance increase as a result. This is how the snowballing starts. But right around this time, that's also when the so-called Xenon are starting to snowball. The Xenon were originally terraformers for the Terrans. They were meant to peacefully prepare the galaxy for human habitation, but something went wrong. Over the centuries, they evolved self-preservation, and when the humans tried to shut them off, the Xenon developed weapons and basically decided to try and genocide all organic life.
Secretly, they began plotting against their creators.
As the game goes on, they'll get stronger and stronger, and without help from the player, it's entirely possible that in your playthrough, factions might get wiped out completely by the Xenon. The galaxy needs your help. But if you want, you can also just let it die. You can turtle up in one corner of space and slowly but steadily build up your own empire, build up your own fleet of ships, and then eventually reclaim the galaxy for yourself. You can do that if you want. The Xenon are kind of like the biters in Factorio in the sense that they are this driving force that keeps you on your toes, that forces you to innovate and expand and stay alive and thrive despite the dangers and challenges. Just like in Factorio, I think they're a brilliant addition to the game. The Xenon make the game significantly better. To help rise to the occasion, probably in the mid-game you'll find yourself with larger and larger fleets, until eventually you'll be able to have your own destroyers and battleships. That first time you get to be on the bridge of one of your destroyers, seeing a dozen or so fighters around you, intercepting enemy ships and seeing all those projectiles and lasers in open space, it feels really cool. But anyway, all of this takes like 100 hours, just to be upfront. And I think it's kind of unlikely that you'll get to the late game in your first playthrough, but thankfully the game has yet another tool up its sleeve to help you out. There's so-called customized game starts. Essentially, the further you progress in a given save, the more points you unlock, the more you can control future game starts. So you don't have to start from scratch again. You can actually start with quite a lot of money or a couple of AI miners or combat vessels with your own station with some research unlocked and so on. If you get tired, simply reinvent yourself. You don't have to lose a lot of progress. Plus, you get a fresh state of the universe in case you messed up your universe beyond recognition. Super nice. Once again, I applaud Egosoft for adding this. This is a really good feature. So anyway, just to conclude, playing X4 Foundations is all about empire building. It's all about controlling the chaotic galaxy and interacting with the various systems that the game possesses, most notably the economy. It's about finding smart strategies for warfare, but also figuring out your own interesting ways to have fun. In that sense, X4 Foundations is kind of about influence, the influence you can exert on the sandbox. And that influence is something that you can actually see. I mean, you get to see the spaceships and the space stations and the battles. They're not just numbers in a menu somewhere. You get to experience them, which helps make your choices feel more meaningful and more impactful. Plus, I think all this stuff looks pretty darn good. And once again, I think it merits its own chapter. Being a space game, most of what you'll be seeing is spaceships, space stations, and open space. But I want it to be very clear that not all sectors look the same. I would even go so far as to say that the various sectors have a lot of personality, to the point where you will start recognizing sectors purely based on their visuals. Sometimes you get to see some planetary bodies rotating in the distance, are greeted with a beautiful background of stars, or you may find yourself in a nebula altogether. I think Egosoft did a fantastic job here to make these levels, which consist of open space, fairly unique. Beyond that, the most visually interesting aspect are the various designs of ships and stations. They tend to mirror the underlying faction to some degree, and I'd like to highlight that by talking about 3 of these factions now. The Boron are one of the most recent additions to X4 and a community favorite. They are aquatic creatures, so their ships look like what I'd expect if you take a fish and let it evolve spaceflight. They have very smooth designs and surfaces and no harsh angles. The ships feature these fins I'd almost expect to start flapping to propel them in space. Their stations share the same design philosophy, with many smooth, almost wave-like structures. Very nice. Boron are particularly strong when it comes to shields and energy weapons, which makes a lot of sense for a culture of technologically advanced but fragile aquatic beings, that it would be shield technology as opposed to thick ship hulls that protects them. Also, I want to highlight that the Boron move around in these floaty tanks of water with these floaty robotic arms attached to them, which is one of the more unique designs I've seen in sci-fi games. Pretty cool. But I do have a question. Where do they pee? Moving on from the Boron, the Terrans pee in normal toilets. Their ships usually have at least one of them. I think. The Terrans kind of remind me of the Empire in Star Wars. Not necessarily aesthetically, but more from the vibe that I'm getting. They're also very technologically advanced, so their ships look very modern and high-tech, albeit they feature a kind of distant efficiency, giving off the feeling of originating from a militaristic society. One of my favorite ship designs is the Honshu, as it has this big solar sail-looking thing in its central body. Very unusual design. I can see someone had a lot of fun making this. They have some of the strongest ships in the game, with the Asgard being particularly popular among X4 Foundation fans. As for their stations, no surprise here either. Lots of smooth surfaces and perfect angles, conveying a sort of cold efficiency, though they look less intimidating than their ship counterparts. Let's look at something completely different. The pair in it are a society built around a sort of religious dictator. They have these strangely angled limbs and 3 eyes, making them one of the more unique races in the X universe. Their ships have lots of parabolic shapes, so sharp edges are hard to find. Everything looks really smooth and noble. It's fitting then that they have some of the fastest ships in the galaxy, though how to relate their speed to their culture, I do not know. Their ships make me feel like their culture definitely appreciates aesthetics and art and conveys this in their design, similar to how the biggest religions in our world express themselves through beautiful paintings, murals, and impressive, smooth architecture. One of their most interesting ships is the Odysseus. It reminds me a bit of these types of speedboats that lift out from the water when going fast. Kind of tempted to see if the Odysseus ship would do the same. Moving on, it probably comes as no surprise to you that their space stations mimic the design of the spaceships. They follow the same logic with smooth parabolic corners. The best way to describe them is by saying that they look kind of alien. They remind me a bit of the Halo Covenant ships. There's of course plenty more races which all have their own unique designs, strengths and weaknesses, and I found it super fun to look at the art direction and connect it to the underlying culture. But this section is more about giving you a general impression as opposed to a long essay, so let's stop here. This concludes the discussion of what the base game has to offer, but thankfully the game's developers made the game moddable, so let's talk about that. Despite the fact that X4 is quite niche, fans are very dedicated, so there's still a lot of mods that allow you to tweak the game experience to your liking. Some mods aim to expand existing mechanics in the game, while others may even remove elements that some players simply don't enjoy. AI is one of those fields, with some mods like CUDA AI tweaks adding new or changing existing behaviors so you can better organize your fleets. I also quite like the mod Secret Stash. For one, because the image is kind of hilarious, but I also like it because it makes police scans never detect illegal items in my inventory. I don't really plan on smuggling drugs, so it doesn't give me a large advantage. But it does allow me to just carry around some crafting materials, which some factions may consider illegal, without having to worry about it. After playing vanilla for a while, many players look for mods like Secret Stash to remove elements from the game that they don't find particularly enjoyable. Other mods allow you to fundamentally tweak how the balance of power in the universe works. Are the Xenon too easy for you? You can consider adding Xenon Hell, which doubles the Xenon weapon damage. Still too easy? Add Xenon Proliferation, which halves the amount of resources that the Xenon need to construct a ship, and then also reduces the build time. Think the universe is still too peaceful? Add the Dynamic Wars mod, which makes factions change their relations randomly to create new fronts and conflicts. Would you like your actions to have more of an impact? How about reactive factions, which ensures that when you help one faction, its enemies will like you less for it, potentially leading to them declaring war on you. And if you ever get tired of the universe in vanilla, there are even mods which add new sectors, change gate connections, or add new factions. If instead you'd like to fundamentally change the balancing of combat, the Variety Rebalancing Overhaul is your best bet. It's probably the most popular mod overall, and for good reason. It changes all of the stat numbers for weapons and shields and makes the 4 size classes of ships feel more distinct. In the footage you are seeing, I'm also rocking a number of graphics and sound mods, but don't worry, the base game itself doesn't look too different to what you've been seeing so far. If you want to go very extreme, there is also the Star Wars Interworlds mod, which is a total conversion overhaul for the game. I've never played it, but if you're a Star Wars fan, you should definitely check this mod out too. As you can see, there really are a ton of options for any use case you could imagine, but really you should play vanilla for at least 20 to 30 hours before adding mods. It'll help you identify what you certainly don't like and want to find a solution for. Plus, it'll help you appreciate additions like new ships or factions more, as you'll have a better understanding for how they will interact with the existing game. In any case, I do think that mods almost always make games better, but sometimes that can mean that a game is only good with mods. And in the case of X4, I do have some criticism. I like to cover niche games because, by definition, these games do not conform to big trends and mechanics. It's a sphere where developers truly have a vision and try to implement it the best that they can, instead of morphing their ideas into something that the majority of gamers will find appealing. This is not without its downsides, however. With the developer of X4, Egosoft, being a small studio, there's only so much that they can pull off. And just because a developer has a vision and realizes it without letting market analysis affect their choices, doesn't mean that that idea actually turns into a good game. So let's discuss some of the more negative aspects of X4 in an effort to get the holistic view. I was just praising the visuals a lot, so let's destroy that image a little bit. X4 Foundations has pretty terrible character models and animations. For me, this totally breaks immersion, especially when watching crews operate on bridges of ships. Most of the game takes place either in your spreadsheet, map, flying your ship yourself, or observing battles in third person. So ultimately, character visuals shouldn't really be that big of a problem. It pains me anyway though, as oftentimes for the story missions, you do talk to characters in person, and they tend to angle their necks so oddly while speaking to you, besides just looking entirely replaceable. This is especially sad because the voice acting is just kind of mediocre.
I welcome you, honored representative Numankaret, and of course, my pioneering heralds. The task entrusted to you is
I was told the German voiceover is better, but that will only apply to about 5% of you guys, according to my analytics. This makes the stories not as engaging as they could be, also because the amount of actual lore that is communicated to you is minimal. Most of what I've learned is through watching cutscenes and dialogues from the previous games. Granted, there is also an in-game wiki in X4, which does allow you to learn more about the lore, but it's still a shame. And just to double back to the first-person related gameplay, there isn't really any. Now, it's true that the first-person perspective gives you much more immersion and lets you appreciate the sense of scale of the game a lot more, but having truly nothing to do in first person? That's a bummer. All these things I've mentioned thus far are something that actually doesn't matter too much for the main gameplay of expanding your empire and interacting with the sandbox. Unfortunately, there are also two major things which cause pain for these crucial gameplay loops. First of all, it's not that the game merely feels like you need to open a spreadsheet on the side to play it effectively. No, it actually feels like the game itself is a spreadsheet. The menu experience is, how do I put this gently, overwhelming. Once you play a few hours, you do understand how it works and where to find stuff, but it never actually feels good. When you need to make split-second changes to AI behavior, it's never a quick operation, something that has cost me a ship or two in the past. I sincerely hope that they can find a way to make the UI better. The game is absolutely playable and it is 100% possible to have a very good time with it, but damn, it takes a while for the game to click, and I primarily blame the UI and the UX. The second aspect that really frustrates me and most of the community is the at times ridiculously frustrating AI. Maybe I'm just salty because I keep losing ships that I know I could save if only I was flying myself, but I don't think I've ever met anyone in the X4 community claiming that the AI is good, so I don't think it's just my frustration speaking. The frustrating AI also removes so much of the awesomeness factor of the battles. Seeing my destroyer just pointing in some random arbitrary direction instead of keeping fire up on the enemy carrier is something that I just don't understand and don't want to understand. Now, to give credit where credit is due, X4 is an absolutely massive sandbox with hundreds if not thousands of active AI actors all independently moving throughout space, moving goods around, fighting and so on. I'm pretty sure that to some degree the poor AI performance is the cost that has to be paid for the overarching AI performing as well as it does and allowing the universe to feel as organic and alive as it does, so I do think they prioritized adequately. The dynamic economy and world simulation is much more important than the combat, but again it does remove some of the immersion and makes the game kind of frustrating sometimes. The community pretty much universally agrees that AI is one of the biggest problems in the game since release and now. They have been making changes over the years, however, and a number of mods exist that add new behaviors for ships, but I think there is something fundamentally broken with how the AI works because it never feels good. It's just different shades of not quite there. Lastly, performance can be a problem in the mid and late game regardless of what specs you have. Given how large the game is and just how much it simulates, this is understandable, but again, removes some of the awesomeness factor at times. That basically summarizes my biggest pain points. But again, I have to emphasize that X4 is something truly, truly unique. I already have over 300 hours in this game, and I don't think I'm going to stop playing it anytime soon. There is so much fun to be had in this, so many interesting stories to generate, so many interesting experiences to make. This criticism chapter is not meant to invalidate all the value that the game provides. I just want to make sure that you understand what you're getting into, and like I said, to help you make an informed decision. So now you've heard the good, the bad, let's conclude. Okay, so should you actually buy X4 Foundations and give it a shot? Well, it depends. Because of how unique X4 Foundations is, I'm super biased. So in my biased opinion, if you're even remotely interested, yes, you should absolutely buy it and try it out. It can help scratch that EVE Online itch of a fully simulated economy, but unlike EVE Online, you can actually get into it. X4 is plenty complex on its own though, but once it clicks, you'll find yourself with that one more turn syndrome that games like Civilization, Stellaris, and Factorio have. At least this was the case for me. I'm going to go to bed soon. I'm just going to get one more ship. I'll do just one more mission. Take out this one group of Xenon, move this one fleet of fighters into position, obtain one more blueprint, until suddenly you get chronic sleep deprivation. But isn't being sleep deprived by a game that you find yourself hopelessly addicted to kind of the feeling that we all strive for? I also especially enjoyed X4 Foundations because I bought a SciTac X52 HOTAS many years ago to play Star Citizen, and I could finally dust it off. Playing on mouse and keyboard is fine too though, and I often found myself doing just that when I couldn't be bothered to set up the HOTAS for a shorter game session. So if you're like me and you have an old pair of a throttle and a stick lying around, this might be the opportunity you've been waiting for. But let's get back to whether you should buy the game or not. In any case, something that the community also almost universally agrees on is that the game is significantly better with the DLCs, though some people do think that they are overpriced for what they deliver. Without the DLCs, you have significantly fewer sectors and fewer factions. Most notably, the Terran and Boron are not in the base game. This doesn't mean that the base game isn't good, quite the contrary. But honestly, I can't imagine playing without the DLCs or at least some mods that add extra factions and sectors. The DLCs also add most of the better story missions, so the game would feel much more hollow without them. However, each new DLC comes with a big free patch, so the base game has actually changed quite a lot since its release in 2018, and even now in 2024, the developers are still working on and releasing new patches and DLCs to improve the game for everybody. You're not just buying a product of today, you're also buying a promise of continuous development and continuous improvement. Little fun fact, the developers have even maintained save game compatibility since release, something that gives them lots of trouble, but a service that they provide to the community nevertheless. I have a lot of respect for Egosoft for doing this. Regardless of whether you agree with the pricing philosophy or not, I do want to reiterate that this is a very niche game from a small developer. This is not a big corporate monster, but a mom and pop style operation, as you can see in these clips from their office. What they have built is very complex, and in order to continuously develop it, they need to make money. Considering the player base is relatively small, upping the price is the only thing they can do. For me, buying the DLC is also about supporting them, not just getting the content. But this is obviously a personal choice, and I unfortunately cannot make it for you. Do keep in mind, however, that most players play the game for hundreds of hours and more, so if it clicks, it sticks. In conclusion, I recommend the game with some reservations. If you are not resistant to a steep learning curve, and if you get frustrated easily due to bugs or confusing game mechanics, then maybe it's better if you give this one a pass. If, however, you absolutely love the idea of a single-player EVE Online or a Mount Blade in space, you're salivating at the thought of becoming an interstellar arms dealer or protector of the galaxy or an invader of worlds, then X4 is basically the only recommendation I can make to you, and it's a very strong recommendation. So, what do you think? Did the video convince you to give the game a shot? Is there a particular feature that you're interested in, or a particular fantasy that you want to live out? I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions, and to get a fresh perspective on the game. Anyway, I'm gonna go back to farming credits to fight back the Xenon. See you in the next one.